Welcome to The Crisis, a day-by-day look at Britain's 1931 crisis, brought to you 90 years on. Since our first episode on the 31st of July, Britain had been engulfed by a financial and political crisis chiefly concerned with a currency panic, a run on the pound. As the crisis erupted, Britain's political class were, with the exception of Chancellor Philip Snowden, on their holidays across Britain and Europe. The parliamentary recess had begun on the same day that the May report was published, and the House of Commons was not due to reconvene until October. MacDonald, Graham, and the Conservative Chamberlain were in Scotland. Henderson was in Wales. Thomas and Clines at Brighton, and Baldwin was in the south of France. They were soon scuttling back to Westminster. The run on the pound was caused by a loss of international confidence in both British banking and government finances. Over the summer of 1931, several Austrian and German banks collapsed, sending shockwaves through Europe's financial system. This event was central to the severe worsening of the Great Depression in Germany that would help Hitler come to power. In an attempt to rescue the situation, the Bank of England and private British banks had afforded considerable credits to the Austrian government, the German Reichsbank, and private banks in Central Europe, but in doing so had overstretched themselves. The British banking system was now vulnerable to a similar collapse as French creditors, in particular, withdrew large sums from London. With so much uncertainty, investors wanted their assets in hard gold and US dollars. The Bank of England, Britain's non-governmental central bank, which underwrote both the British banks and the currency, was facing serious difficulties in attempting to defend British credit and sterling, not least because they themselves had committed too much to help the Germans and Austrians. They had lost £22 million worth of gold by the 22nd of July. The governor of the Bank of England, Sir Montague Norman, had a nervous collapse and was out of action. It is worth bearing in mind that in 1931, sterling was probably the most important global currency, used by a quarter of the world, and London remained the world's main financial center. A collapse in sterling, therefore, would have destroyed not just Britain, but devastated economies across the globe. In order to try to prevent this, the bank obtained £25 million worth of credits from Paris and New York. However, the run on sterling continued. On the 5th of August, the bank lost £4.5 million worth of gold in a single day, and the deputy governor, Sir Ernest Harvey, revealed that an eye-watering £66 million in gold and foreign exchange had been drained from the bank's reserves in the last fortnight in defending sterling. The Bank of England, therefore, needed, in essence, a bailout from the government. The government was going to have to secure credits for the Bank of England to use to defend sterling and the City of London. However, this was not just a financial confidence crisis, it was a political one too. The crucial aspect of the whole crisis was that the British government did not have the confidence of the international financial markets, primarily New York and Paris. For the government to borrow money with which to save sterling and the British banking system, it needed to find creditors. But with the Labour government drifting and the recently published May report predicting a giant budget deficit of £120 million, confidence in the British government was at rock bottom. Why lend money to people who cannot meet their financial obligations? Therefore, to recap, in order to save the British banks in sterling, the Bank of England needed credit, and in order to get credit, the British government was going to have to take out a loan. However, foreign creditors were not willing to give the government a loan while the budget deficit was so large. On the 31st of July, the government had promised to consider the May report in late August and present proposals for balancing the budget when Parliament returned in October. It was clear action was needed now, not in a few months' time. On the 7th of August, Chancellor of the Exchequer Philip Snowden wrote to Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald asking that he return from his holiday in Lossiemouth, which he did on the 10th of August. On the 11th, MacDonald and Snowden had a 6-hour conference with Sir Ernest Harvey and another Bank of England governor, Edward Peacock. Their message was stark. The Bank of England could obtain no more loans. The country was on the edge of the precipice. The British government would have to borrow a figure in the region of £80 million to provide to the bank. However, given the current budget deficit, the international confidence to secure such a loan was not there. MacDonald wrote in his diary that night that the bankers, apparently sidestepping their own responsibility, told him, quote, "The failure to balance the budget is forfeiting confidence in sterling. Something should be done at once to prove the budget is to be balanced." They said something would have to be done within a few days, a fortnight at the outside. As such, MacDonald arranged a meeting of the Cabinet Economy Committee of 5 to meet the following day to discuss the May report and how to balance the books. MacDonald and Snowden decided that the committee would meet for 2 days before the ministers went away for the weekend to work on the details separately. They would then reconvene on Monday, the 17th, to put the finishing touches on a definite program. The bankers also requested permission to bring the opposition leaders up to speed, and therefore, on the 12th to 13th of August, Baldwin, Chamberlain, and Samuel arrived in London at the summons of the Bank of England. Given Labour was a minority government, cooperation from the opposition would be needed for any action taken to tackle the crisis. At 4 p.m. on Wednesday, 12th of August, the Cabinet Economy Committee of Ramsay MacDonald, Philip Snowden, Arthur Henderson, Jimmy Thomas, and Willie Graham met for the first time at 10 Downing Street, 13 days earlier than originally intended. Chancellor Snowden not only informed the Labour ministers of the seriousness of the situation, he also dropped the bombshell that the projected budget deficit for 1932-3 was in fact £170 million, not the £120 million the May report had predicted. The challenge they were facing was therefore far greater than had been imagined. Snowden then set out his proposals as to how the government should balance the budget. It might be remembered from part 1 of this series that the May Committee recommended £96 million worth of cuts and just £24 million of tax rises, but that the Labour members of the committee had dissented on a number of these points. Snowden had wanted to more or less match the recommendations of the May report. However, MacDonald knew these would be unpalatable to the Labour Party. He also knew that the Liberal and Conservative parties would oppose too many tax rises to close the deficit. Instead, MacDonald quickly improvised, seeking a compromise in the hope of building a broad consensus between the three parties. He proposed what he called equal sacrifice, a more or less 50-50 split between increased taxation and budget cuts. Snowden saw the appeal of this formula and adapted his own plans in time for the Economy Committee's first meeting. The Chancellor presented to his colleagues a program for £78 million worth of cuts, a retreat from the £96 million the May report had recommended. Despite the projected budget deficit being considerably worse, on the crucial point of a 20% cut in unemployment benefit, Snowden proposed merely a 10% cut, which, given the collapse in the cost of living since the Depression hit, would mean the unemployed were still better off in real terms than they had been in the 1920s. It must be noted that none present appear to have questioned the need for cuts or the possibility of taking sterling off the gold standard, and neither did anyone propose any alternative economic strategy than that of Snowden. The Labour ministers were, quote, of one mind, MacDonald told the press that day, in their determination to balance the budget. Was there an alternative policy? MacDonald had written to the radical liberal economist John Maynard Keynes at the start of August to get his reaction to the May report. Keynes, in the face of the run on the pound, changed his view on the gold standard. Having advised MacDonald to stick to it earlier in the summer, he now believed devaluation was inevitable, and therefore balancing the budget to save sterling was pointless. He proposed a conference of every living former Chancellor of the Exchequer that would be asked to agree to a 25% devaluation in sterling and the creation of a currency union of the entire empire, as well as the nations of South America, Asia, Central Europe, and the Mediterranean. However, Keynes's was a lone voice. His general theory would not be published for another 5 years, and it would not be until after the Second World War that his ideas gained wide acceptance. Every other economist, expert, and financier that MacDonald and Snowden had contact with before and during the crisis were insistent that sterling must be saved by balancing the budget. MacDonald, unsurprisingly, was not attracted to Keynes's devaluation and currency union scheme, which sounded harebrained and impractical, ran contrary to all other advice he had received, and almost certainly could not have been implemented in time. Not only that, but on the 12th of August, Keynes actually changed his mind again. Realizing the seriousness and immediacy of the crisis, he wrote to MacDonald that the gold standard could still be saved, and that he would support any suitably drastic measures to do so. As historian Philip Williamson has written, Keynes's fluctuating guidance to MacDonald was, quote, hopeless as policy advice in an emergency. Therefore, all the advice the government received, even from the radical Keynes, was to balance the books and save the pound. Moreover, what was occurring in August 1931 was a confidence crisis. In a sense, economics were irrelevant. What was important was the confidence of the international money markets, not what may or may not have been sound economics with retrospect. Foreign investors did not believe their money was safe in London. They did not want to lend further money to a government that appeared to have lost control of public finances. Would they ever get their money back? Whatever we might believe could have solved the crisis with hindsight is largely irrelevant. What was required was a solution that would restore confidence on the financial markets of 1931. As Colin Bell wrote in the 1970s, when Keynesianism had become economic orthodoxy, quote, "If Ramsay MacDonald had told the world that he had no intention of balancing the budget, but was embarking on a sustained program of reflation and deficit financing, he would have lost a vote of confidence, and no one would have loaned the Bank of England or the government any money. To come off the gold standard and devalue sterling, or for the bank's reserves to run dry in such circumstances, could have led to chaos and a dramatic fall in the value of the pound." The politicians of 1931 had the recent memory of the German hyperinflation at the front of their minds. Philip Snowden, raised in thrifty poverty where every spare penny was saved in the village bank, could not countenance reducing the value of the hard-earned savings of the working people. Labour was a minority government that required liberal and conservative support, and the opposition parties demanded a balanced budget. There was not to be, and indeed, there probably could not have been, any alternative policy. The Economic Committee of Labour's Big Five met again at 11 a.m. on Thursday, 13th of August, but just before this, MacDonald and Snowden had seen the acting Liberal leader Sir Herbert Samuel. Lloyd George was of course convalescing after his recent operation. Labour would need at the very least Liberal support to pass these emergency measures through Parliament, and therefore Samuel was informed of the £170 million deficit and reassured that drastic tax rises and spending cuts were in the pipeline. Samuel promised his support for this course of action and was reassured there were no plans for the introduction of tariffs. We have no real record of what was discussed at the Cabinet Economy Committee on the 13th, but we can assume they continued to debate Snowden's proposed program of cuts. At 2 p.m., MacDonald and Snowden were then visited by the Conservative leaders Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain. Chamberlain wrote to a colleague of the meeting, quote, "At the interview, Ramsay MacDonald was characteristically vague and woolly, but as I knew what I wanted to know, I was able to put one or two questions which elicited definite answers from him or Snowden, and the position is now pretty plain. The Cabinet Committee have decided that the budget must be balanced, but that there must be equality of sacrifice. The May Committee contains many impossible recommendations, but the departments concerned are to be told to make their own proposals for reduction. The total reduction aimed at being in the neighborhood of 100 million. This will leave a large gap to be made up out of taxation. I do not know what it is, but the Chancellor said the situation was worse than indicated by the May Committee." It is clear the Labour leaders told Samuel more than they told the Conservatives, almost certainly because the Liberals had been Labour's ally in Parliament in maintaining their minority government. Baldwin said little other than to reassure the Labour leaders that the Conservatives would be supportive, although he could not make any promises until he had seen the full proposals. Satisfied that nothing more needed to be done for the moment, Baldwin decided to resume his holiday in the south of France, giving Chamberlain a free hand in dealing with the government. Meanwhile, the Economy Committee agreed to meet for a third time after the weekend on Monday, the 17th of August. Then, the opposition leaders would attend a conference with the government on the 18th, and the full Labour cabinet had been recalled to meet on Wednesday, the 19th. The hope was that the committee would be agreed on a program to balance the budget by Monday, which they could then present to their cabinet colleagues and the other parties. Arthur Henderson, party secretary and ever mindful of rank-and-file opinion, insisted that having secured the approval of the cabinet, the leading Labour ministers would then meet the Labour Party's national executive and the General Council of the Trades Union Congress, the TUC, on the 20th of August to inform the wider Labour movement about the coming cuts and tax rises, and hopefully secure their consent. This, then, was the Labour government's roadmap out of the crisis. However, it would not be long before the government was forced off track. Thanks so much for watching episode 4 of The Crisis. If you enjoyed it, consider dropping a like, really helps us out, and if you're not already, consider subscribing as well. Finally, as always, we'd like to thank our patrons, including our executive producers, Eustace Abel, Jeremy Marcoux, Tom McCool, and Tony Churin, for helping to support the show. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next episode.